Dear citizens of Russia, dear friends, the topic of my speech is the events in Ukraine and why it is important for us, for Russia. Of course, my appeal is also addressed to our compatriots in Ukraine. We will have to speak in depth, in detail. The question is very serious. The situation in the Donbass has again acquired a critical, acute character. And today, I'm addressing you directly in order not only to assess what is happening, but also to inform you about the decision being made, about possible further steps in the direction. Let me emphasize once again that Ukraine, for us, is not just a neighboring country. It is an integral part of our own history, culture, spiritual space. There are our comrades, relatives, among whom are not only colleagues, friends, former colleagues, but also relatives, people connected with us by blood, family ties. For a long time, the inhabitants of the southwestern historical Old Russia lands called themselves Russia and Orthodox, so it was until the 17th century when the part of these territories was reunited with the Russian state and after. It seems to us that, in principle, we all know about this, what we are talking about, well-known facts. At the same time, in order to understand what is happening today, to explain the motives of Russia's actions and goals that we set for ourselves, it is necessary to say at least a few words about the history of the issue. So, I start with the fact that modern Ukraine was entirely and completely created by Russia. More precisely, Bolshevik, Communist Russia. This process began almost immediately after the revolution of 1917. And Lenin and his associates did it a very rude way towards Russia itself, by separating, tearing away from it part of its own historical territories. Of course, no one asked about anything to the millions of people who lived there. When, on the eve and after the Great Patriotic War, Stalin already annexed to the USSR and transferred to Ukraine some lands that previously belonged to Poland, Romania and Hungary. At the same time, as a kind of compensation, Stalin endowed Poland with a part of the original German territories, and in 1954, Khrushchev, for some reason, took away Crimea from Russia and also presented it to Ukraine. Actually, this is how the territory of Soviet Ukraine was formed. But now, I would like to pay attention to this initial period of the creation of the USSR. I think this is extremely important for us. You have to go, as they say, from far. Let me remind you, after the October Revolution of 1917, the subsequent civil war, the Bolsheviks began to build a new statehood, and quite sharp disagreements arose between them. Stalin, who in 1922 combined the posts of the General Secretary of the Central Committee of the RCPB and the People Commissar of Nationalities, proposed building the country on the principles of autonomization, but is given the republic's future administrative territorial units a broad power when they join a single state. Lenin criticized this plan and offered to make concessions to the nationalists, as he then called them, независимцы, independence. It was this Lenin's ideas, that fact of the confederate state and slogan about right of nations as self-determination up to secession that formed the basis of Soviet statehood. First, in 1922, when they were enshrined in the Declaration of Formation of the USSR, and then, after the death of Lenin, and in the Constitution of the USSR in 1924. Many questions immediately arise here. And the first of them, in fact, the main one, why was it necessary to satisfy any immediately growing nationalist ambitions on the outskirts of the former empire from the Lord's shoulders, to transfer the newly formed and often arbitrarily formed administrative units, the Union Republics, huge territories, but often had nothing to do with them at all. I repeat, to convey together with the population of historical Russia. Moreover, in fact, these administrative units were given the status and form of national state formations. Again, I ask myself, why was it necessary to make such generous gifts, which a most ardent nationalist had never even dreamed of before, and even gave the Republicans the right to secede from the United States without any conditions? At first glance, this is generally incomprehensible, some kind of madness, but it is only at first glance. There is an explanation. After the revolution, the main task of the Bolsheviks was to stay in power at any cost, precisely at any cost. For the sake of this, they did everything, both to the humiliating conditions of the Brest peace at the time when the Kaiser Germany and its allies were in a difficult military and economic situation, and the outcome of the First World War was actually a foregone conclusion, and satisfy any demands, any wishes from the outside nationalists within the country. From the point of view of historical fate of Russia and its people, Lenin's people principle of state building turned out to be just a mistake. It was, as worse than a mistake. After the collapse of the USSR in 1991, this became absolutely obvious. Of course, the events of the past cannot be changed, but we must at least speak about them directly and honestly, without any reservations and without any political overtones. I can only add on my own behalf that the considerations of the current political situation, no matter how spectacular, winning they may seem at the particular moment in time, under no circumstances cannot be taken as the basis of basic principles of statehood. I don't blame anyone to anything now. The situation in the country at that time and after the civil war on the eve was incredibly difficult, critical. Today, I just want to say that it was exactly like that. This is historical fact. Actually, as I have already said, as a result of the Bolshevik policy, Soviet Ukraine arose, which even today can with good reason be called Ukraine, named after Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. He is author and architect. This he is fully confirmed by archival document, including Lenin's harsh directives on the Donbass, which was literally squeezed to enter Ukraine. And now, grateful descendants have demolished monument to Lenin in Ukraine. This is what they call decommunization. Do you want decommunization? Well, let's use us just fine. But it is not necessary, as they say, to step halfway. We are ready to show what the real decommunization means for Ukraine. Return to the history of the issue, I repeat that in 1922 the USSR was formed in the territory of the former Russian Empire. But life itself immediately showed that it was simply impossible to preserve such a huge and complex territory, or not to manage it on the proposed amorphous, in fact, confederal principles. They were completely divorced from both reality and historical tradition. It is natural that the Red Terror and the rapid transition to the Stalinist dictatorship, the dominance of the communist ideology and the Communist Party monopoly on power, nationalization and planned system of the national economy, all this in fact turned into a simple declaration, into a formally declared but not working principle of the state system. In reality, the Union Republics did not have any sovereign right. They simply did not exist, but in practice, a strictly centralized, absolutely unitary state was created. Stalin, in fact, fully implemented in practice not Lenin's but his own ideas for state structure, but he did not make the corresponding changes to the Blackburn documents, the constitution of the country, did not formally revised the proclamation of Leninist principle of building the USSR. Yes, apparently it seemed that there was no fit for this. Under the conditions of the totalitarian regime, everything worked anyway, and outwardly it looked beautiful, attractive, and even super democratic. And yet, it's pity that from the basic, formal legal foundation in which our entire statehood was built, ideals, utopian, inspired by the revolution, by absolutely destructive fantasies for any normal country, were not cleaned out in the timely manner. Nobody thought about the future, as it often happened with us before. The leaders of Communist Party seemed to be sure that they had succeeded in forming a solid system of government, that thought their policy they had finally solved the national question. But falsification, substitution of concept, manipulation of public consciousness, and deceit the costly. The bacillus of national ambitions had not disappeared, and the initially late mine, which undermines the state immunity against the infection of nationalism, was only waiting in the wings. Such mine, I repeat, was the right that seceded from the USSR. In the mid-1980s, against the backdrop of growing socio-economic problems, the obvious crisis of the planet economy, the national question, the essence of which is expectations and unfulfilled aspirations of the peoples of the Union, but primarily the growing appetites of local elites. Empire become more and more aggravated. However, instead of deep analysis of situation, taking adequate measures, primarily in the economy, as well as gradual, thoughtful, balanced transformation of the political system and state structure, the leadership of the CPSU limited itself through outright verbiage about restoring the Leninist principle of national self-determination. Moreover, in the course of the unfolding struggle of power within the Communist Party itself, each of the warring parties, in order to expand the base of support, began to thoughtlessly stimulate, encourage nationalist sentiments, play on them, promising their potential supporters whatever they wish, against the backdrop of superficial and populist chatter about democracy and bright future built on the basis of either a market or a planning economy, but in condition of real impoverishment of people and total shortage. None of those in power even thought about the inevitable tragic consequences for the country. And they completely went along with the path beaten at the dawn of the creation of the USSR to satisfy ambition of the nationalist elite to grow in their own party ranks, while forgetting with the CPSU no longer has hands, and thank God such tools for men in power and the country itself at stake terror dictatorship of the Stalin type, and even then the notorious leading role of the party, like morning mist, disappears without a trace right before their eyes. And in September 1989, the plenum of the Central Party of the CPSU, the essential fatal document, was adopted, the so-called national policy of the party in modern condition of the platform of the CPSU. It contains the following provisions. I will quote: "The Union republics have all rights corresponding to their status to sovereign socialist state." And more point. The highest representative authorities of the Union republics may protest and oppose the decision and order of the Union governments in their territory. And finally, each Union Republic has its own citizenship, which applies to all its inhabitants. Was it not obvious with such formulation and decision would lead to? Now, it is not time, not the place to go into questions of state or constitutional law to define the very concept of citizenship. But still, the question arises: why, in those already difficult conditions, was it necessary to rock the country even more in this way? The fact remains. 2 years before the collapse of the USSR, its fate was actually a foregone conclusion. It is now the radicals and nationalists, including and above all in Ukraine, who attribute to themselves the merit of gaining independence. As we can see, it is not all at stakes. The historical, strategic mistakes of the leaders of the Bolsheviks, the leadership of CPSU, made at different times the state-building, economic and national policy, lead to the disintegration of our united country. The collapse of historical Russia under the name of the USSR on their conscience. Despite all this injustice, deceit and outside robbery of Russia, our people, namely the people, recognize the new geopolitical realities that arose after the collapse of the USSR, recognize the new independent states, and they not only admitted it. Russia itself, being in a difficult situation at the time, helped its partners in the CIS, including Ukrainian colleagues, from whom right from the moment of independence numerous requests for material support began to arrive. And our country provided such support with respect and dignity and sovereignty of Ukraine. According to expert estimates, which are confirmed by simple calculation of our energy prices, the volume of soft loans, economic and trade preferences that Russia provided to Ukraine, the total benefit for the Ukraine budget for the period from 1991 to 2013 amounted to about $250 billion. But this is not all. By the end of 1991, the debt obligation of the USSR to foreign states and international funds amounted to about $100 billion. And initially, it was assumed that these loans would be returned by all the republics of the former USSR in solidarity, in proportion of their economic potential. However, Russia took upon itself the repayment of the entire Soviet debt and paid it off in full, completed this process in 2017. In return, the newly independent states were to give up their share of Soviet foreign assets, and corresponding agreements were reached in December 1994 with Ukraine. However, Kiev did not ratify these agreements and later simply refused to complete. Putin claimed the diamond fund, gold reserves, as well as property and other assets of the former USSR abroad. And yet, despite the well-known problems, Russia has always cooperated with Ukraine openly, honestly, and I repeat, with respect for its interests. Our ties have developed in various fields. Thus, in 2011, the bilateral trade turnover exceeded $50 billion. I note that the volume of Ukraine's trade with all United European countries in 2019, that is, even before the pandemic, was inferior or this indicator. At the same time, it was evident that the Ukrainian authorities preferred to act in such a way that they would have all the right and advantages to relations with Russia, but not incur any obligations. Instead of partnership, dependency began to prevail, which of the part of the Kiev authorities sometimes acquired on absolutely enormous character. Suffice it to recall the permanent blackmail in the field of energy, transit and banal theft of the gas. I will add that Kiev tried to use the dialogue with Russia as a pretext for bargaining with the West, blackmail it with reproaching with Moscow, knocking out preference for itself. They say, otherwise Russian influence on Ukraine will grow. At the same time, the Ukrainian authorities initially, I want to emphasize this, it was from the very first step that they began to build their statehood on the denial of everything that unites us. They sought to distort the consciousness, historical memory of millions of people, entire generation living in Ukraine. No surprise the Ukrainian society faces the rise of extreme nationalism, which quickly took the form of aggressive Russophobia and neo-Nazism. Hence, the participation of Ukrainian nationalists and neo-Nazis in terrorist gangs in North Caucasus, and the increasingly louder territorial claims against Russia. External forces also played their role, which, with the help of an extensive network of NGOs and special services, grew the clientele in Ukraine and promoted its representatives to power. It is also important to understand that Ukraine, in fact, has never had the stable tradition of its true statehood. And starting from 1991, she took the path of mechanical copying of other people's models, cut off from both history and Ukrainian realities. Political state institutions were constantly reshaped to suit the rapidly formed clans with their own selfish interests, which had nothing to do with the interests of the people of Ukraine. The whole point of the so-called pro-Western civilization chose of the Ukraine oligarchic government is not to create better conditions for the well-being of the people, but to obsequiously render services to Russia's geopolitical rivals, to save billions of dollars stolen from Ukrainians and hidden by oligarchs in accounts in Western banks. Some industrial financial groups taken by them for the maintenance of the party and politics initially relied on nationalists and radicals. Others verbally advocated good relations with Russia for the culture and linguistic diversity and came to power with the help of the vote of citizens who sincerely supported such aspirations, including millions of residents of the Southeast. But having received post positions, they immediately betrayed their voters, renounced their election promises, and carried out real politics under the dictation of the radicals, sometimes persecuting their yesterday's allies, those public organizations that advocated bilingualism for cooperation with Russia. They took advantage of the fact that the people who supported them, as a rule, were law-abiding, more moderate views, accustomed to trusting to authorities. Unlike the radicals, they would not show aggression or resort to illegal actions. In turn, the radicals became impudent. Their claims to grow year after year. It turned out to be easy for them to impose their will over and over again on a weak government which itself was infected with the virus of nationalism and corruption, and skillfully replaced the true culture, economic, social interest of people, the real sovereignty of Ukraine, with various kinds of speculation on national soil and external ethnographic paraphernalia. A stable statehood of Ukraine has not developed, and political, electoral procedures serve only a cover as a screen for redistribution of power and poverty between various oligarchic clans. Corruption, which without doubt is a challenging problem of many countries, including Russia, has acquired some special character in Ukraine. It literally permitted and corroded Ukraine's statehood, the entire system or branches of power. The radicals took advantage of the justified discontent of the people, saddled the protest, and in 2014 brought Maidan to a coup d'etat. At the same time, they received direct assistance from foreign states. According to reports, the material support of the so-called protest camp on Independence Square in Kiev from the US Embassy amounted to $1 million a day. Additionally, very large sums were impudently transferred directly to the bank accounts of opposition leaders. And it was about tens of millions of dollars. And how much did they really injure people? The family of those who died in the clashes provoked in the streets and squares of Kiev and other cities received in the end. It's better not to ask about it. The radicals who seized power organized a persecution, real terror against those who opposed anti-constitutional actions. Politicians, journalists, public figures were mocked, they were publicly humiliated. Ukrainian cities were swept by a wave of pogroms and violence, a series of high-profile and unpunished murders. It is impossible without a shadow to remember the terrible tragedy in Odessa. The participants in a peaceful protest were brutally murdered, burned alive in the house of trade unions. The criminals who committed this atrocity are not punished, and no one is looking for them, but we know them by name, and will do everything to punish them, find them, and bring them to justice. Maidan did not bring Ukraine closer to democracy and progress, having carried out a coup d'etat. The nationalists and those political forces that supported them finally brought the situation to a standstill, pushed Ukraine into an abyss to a civil war. 8 years after those events, the country is split. Ukraine is experiencing an acute socio-economic crisis. According to international organizations, in 2019, almost 6 million Ukrainians. I emphasize that this is about 50%, not of the able bodies, but of the entire population of the country, the first to go abroad in search of work, and often, as a rule, for daily unskilled earnings. The following fact is also indicative. Since 2020, our 60,000 doctors and other health workers have left the country during the pandemic. Since 2014, tariffs for water supply have increased by almost a third, for electricity by several times, for gas for households by dozens of times. Many people simply do not have money to pay for utilities. They literally have to survive. What happened? Why is all this happening? The answer is obvious. Because the dowry received not only from the Soviet era but also from the Russian Empire was squandered and taken into pockets. Tens and hundreds of thousands of jobs have been lost each, thanks, among their things, to close cooperation with Russia, gave people to stable income and brought taxes in the trash. Industries such as mechanical engineering, instrumentation, electronics, shipbuilding and aircraft building are entire line on their side and completely destroyed, and the fact they were once proud only for Ukraine but of the united entire Soviet Union. In 2021, the Chernobylsky shipbuilding plant in Nikolaev was liquidated, where the first shipyard was laid down under Catherine II. The famous Antonov concern has not produced a single serious aircraft since 2016, and Yuzhmash plant, which specialized in production of rocket and space technology, was on the verge of bankruptcy, like the Kremenchuk steel plant. This at least As for the gas transportation system, which was created by the entire Soviet Union, it is also dilapidated its whole operation to associate with a great risk and environmental costs. And in this regard, the question arises, is poverty, hopelessness, the loss of industrial and technological potential, this is a very pro-Western civilization, choice that has been fooling and fooling millions of people for many years, promising them paradise. In fact, it all came down to the fact that the collapse of the Ukrainian economy is accomplished with outright robbery of the citizens of the country, and Ukraine itself was simply driven under external control. It is carried out not only at the behest of the Western capitalists, but also, as I say, directly on the spot, through the whole network of foreign advisors, NGOs and other institutions deployed in Ukraine. They have a direct impact on all the most important personal decisions, on all branches and levels of government, from the central and even the municipal, on the main state-owned companies and corporations, including Naftogaz, Ukrenergo, Ukrainian Railways, Ukroboronprom, Ukropochta, administration of the seaports of Ukraine. There is simply no independent court in Ukraine. At the request of the West, the Kiev authorities gave representatives of the international organization the pre-imperative right to the select members of the highest judicial bodies, the Council of Justice and Qualification Commission of Judges. In addition, the US Embassy directly controls the National Corruption Prevention Agency, the National Anti-Corruption Bureau, the Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office and the Supreme Anti-Corruption Court, all this done under the plausible pretext to increase the effectiveness of the fight against corruption. Okay, but where is the results? Corruption has plummeted as luxuriantly and blooms more than ever. The Ukrainians themselves, aware of all this managerial methods, do they understand that the country is not even under the political and economical protectorate, but reduced to the level of the colony with a puppet regime? The privatization of the state has led to the fact that the government, which called itself the power of patriots, has lost its national character and consistently moving towards the complete desovereignization of the country. The course towards diversification and forced assimilation countries. The Верховная Rada is constantly issuing new discriminatory acts, and the law of so-called indigenous people is already in force. People who consider themselves Russian would like to preserve their identity, language, culture. We made clear that they are strangers in Ukraine. In accordance with the law on education and on the function of the Ukrainian language as the state language, Russia is expelled from schools, from all public spheres up to ordinary shops. The law on the so-called illustration, the cleansing of power, made it possible to deal with objectionable civil servants. Acts are proliferating that give the Ukrainian law enforcement against just ground for the harsh superior of the freedom, speech, dissent, and the perception of opposition. The world-known the said practice of unilateral illegitimate sanctions against other states, foreign individuals, and political interests. In Ukraine, they outdid their persecutors and invented such a tool as sanction against their own citizens, enterprises, TV channel, other media, and even parliament deputies. In Kiev, they continue to prepare reprisals against the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. And this is not an emotional assessment. This is evidenced by specific decisions and documents. The Ukrainian authorities have cynically turned the tragedy of the church schism into the instrument of state policy. The current leadership of the country does not respond to questions from citizens of Ukraine to repeal laws on the infringement of the right of the believers. Moreover, the Rada registered the new restriction bill against the clergy and millions of parishioners of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Moscow Patriarchate. Separately, I will say about Crimea. The inhabitants of the peninsula have made their free choice to be together with Russia. The Kiev authorities have nothing to oppose to this clear view of the people. So they rely on aggressive actions, on the activization of extremist cells, including radical Islamic organizations, on the infiltration of sabotage groups to commit terrorist acts at critical infrastructure, to kidnap Russia's citizens. We have direct evidence that such aggressive actions are carried out with the support of foreign intelligence services. In March 2021, Ukraine adopted a new military strategy. This document is almost entirely devoted to confrontation with Russia, aims to draw foreign states into conflict with our country. The strategy proposes the organization in Russia, Crimea, and on the territory of Donbass infected terrorists underground. It also spills out of the contours of the proposed war, and it should end, as it seems to today, Kiev strategies. I will quote further. With the assistance of the international community on favorable terms for Ukraine. And also, as they say today in Kiev, I also quote here, listen carefully, please. This military support from the world community in the geopolitical confrontation with the Russian Federation. In fact, this is nothing more than preventing the hostilities against our country, against Russia. We also know that there have already been statements of Ukrainians is going to create its own nuclear weapons. And this is not empty bravado. Ukraine does indeed still have Soviet nuclear technologies and means of delivering such weapons, including aviations, as well as .U operational tactic missiles, also of Soviet design, with a range of more than 100 kilometers. But they will do more, it's only a matter of time. There are backlogs from the Soviet era. Thus, it will be much easier for Ukraine to acquire tactical nuclear weapons than for some other states. I will not name them now who actually conduct such developments, especially in the case of technology support from abroad, and we should not exclude this either. With the appearance of the weapons of mass destruction in Ukraine, the situation in the world, in Europe, especially for us, for Russia, will change in most radical way. We cannot fail to react to this real danger, especially, I repeat, that Western patrons can contribute to the appearance of such weapons in Ukraine in order to create another threat to our country. We see how persistently the military pumping of the Kiev regime is carried out. Since 2014, the United States alone has allocated billions of dollars of these purposes, including supply of weapons, equipment, and training of specialists. In recent months, Western weapons are coming to Ukraine just in a continuous stream, defiantly in front of the whole world. The activities of the armed force and special services of Ukraine are led by foreign advisors. We know this very well. In recent years, under the pretext of exercises, military contingents of NATO countries have been almost constantly prevented on the territory of Ukraine. The command and control systems of the Ukrainian troops are already integrated in the NATO once. This means that the command of Ukraine armed force, even individual unit as the unit, can be directly exercised from NATO headquarters. The United States and NATO have begun to shamelessly develop the territory of Ukraine as a theater of potential military operations. Regular joint exercises have a clear anti-Russia focus. Last year alone, more than 23,000 servicemen and over 1,000 pieces of equipment took part in them. A law has already been adopted in the admission in 2022 of the armed forces for the other states and the territory of Ukraine to participate in multinational exercises. It is clear that we are talking primarily about NATO troops, and in the coming year, at least 10 such joint maneuvers are planned. It is obvious that such events serve as a cover for rapid build-up of a NATO military grouping in the territory of Ukraine. Moreover, the network of airfield modernized with the help of the Americans, Borispol's, Ivano-Frankovsk, Chuguyev, Odessa, and so on, is capable of ensuring the transfer of the military units in the shortest possible time. The airspace of Ukraine is open for flights by US strategic and reconnaissance aircraft and named aerial vehicles that are used to monitor the territory of Russia. I will add that the Naval Operations Center in Achakov, built by the Americans, make it possible to ensure the actions of NATO ships, including to use high-precision weapons by them against the Russian Black Sea Fleet and our infrastructure along the entire Black Sea coast. At one time, the United States intended to create similar facilities in Crimea, but the Crimeans and Sevastopol thwarted these plans. We will always remember this. I repeat, today such a center has been deployed. It has already been deployed in Achakova. Let me remind that you in the 18th century the soldier of Alexander Suvorov fought in this city. Thanks for their courage he became part of Russia when in the 8th century the lands of Black Sea region annexed to Russia as a result of ruin Ottoman Empire were called Novorossia. Now they are trying to consign these milestones of history to oblivion, as well as names of the state military figures of the Russian Empire. Without those work, modern Ukraine would not have many large cities, even the very exit to the Black Sea. Recently, the monument Alexander Suvorov was demolished in Poltava. What can you say? Renounce your own past from so-called colonial heritage of the Russian Empire? Well, then be consistent here. Further, I note that Article 17 of the Constitution of Ukraine does not allow the deployment of foreign military bases on its territory, but it turned out that it's just a convention that can be easily circumvented. 10 missions of NATO countries are deployed in Ukraine. There, in fact, are already foreign military bases. They just called the base a mission, and a treatment is an impact. Kiev has long proclaimed the strategic course toward joining NATO. Yes, of course, each country has the right to choose its own security system and conclude military alliances. And everything seemed to be so, if not for one but. International documents expressly state the principle of equal and invisible security, which, as you know, include an obligation not to strengthen the security at the expense of the security of other states. I can also refer here to the 1999 OSCE Charter for European Security, adopted in Istanbul, and the 2010 OSCE Iceland Declaration. In other words, the choice of ways to ensure security should not pose the threat to other states. The Ukraine's entry into NATO is a direct threat to Russia's security. Let me remind you what the back in April 2008 at the Bucharest summit of the North Atlantic Alliance. The United States punished through the decision of Ukraine, and by the way, Georgia would become NATO members. Many European allies of the United States were already well aware of the risks of such prospect, but were forced to come to terms with the will of their senior partner. The Americans simply used them to carry out a pronounced anti-Russia policy. A number of member states of Alliance are still very skeptical about the appearance of Ukraine in NATO. At the same time, we receive a signal from some European capitals. They say, "What are you going through? It won't happen literally tomorrow." In fact, our American partners are also talking about this. Well, we answer, if not tomorrow, when the day after tomorrow? What does this change in a historical perspective? Basically, nothing. Moreover, we know the position and the words of the leadership of the United States that active hostilities in eastern Ukraine did not exclude the possibility of this country joining NATO if it can meet the criteria of the North Atlantic Alliance and defeat corruption. At the same time, they tried to convince us over and over again that NATO is a peace-loving and purely defensive alliance, like there are no threats to Russia. Again, they offer a take a word, but we know the real value of such words. In 1990, when the issue of German unification was discussed, the Soviet leadership was promised by the United States that there would be no extension of NATO jurisdiction and military presence 1 inch to the east, and that the unification of Germany will not lead to spread of NATO's military organization to the east. This is the quote. They talked, gave verbal assurances, and everything turned out to be an empty phrase. Later, they began to assure us that the accession to NATO of the countries of Central and Eastern Europe would only improve relations with Moscow, relieves these countries of the fears of the heavy historical legacy, and even moreover create the belt of state friendly to Russia. Everything turned out exactly the opposite. The authorities of some Eastern European countries trading in Russophobia brought their complexes and stereotypes about the Russia threat to the alliance, insisted of building up collective defense potential which should be deployed primarily against Russia. Moreover, this happened in the 1990s and early 2000s when, thanks to openness and our goodwill, relations between Russia and the West were at the high level. Russia has fulfilled all its obligations, including the withdrawal of troops from Germany from the state of Central and Eastern Europe, and thus has made a huge contribution to overcoming the legacy of the Cold War. We have consistently promised various options for cooperation, including in the format of the Russian NATO Council and the OSCE. Moreover, I will say now what I have never said publicly. I will say it for the first time. In 2000, during a visit to Moscow by outgoing US President Bill Clinton, I asked him, how would America feel about having Russia join NATO? I won't reveal all the details of what conversation, but the reaction to my question looked, let's say, very restrained. And how the Americans really reacted to this opportunity can actually be seen in their practical steps toward our country. These are open support for terrorists in the North Caucasus, disregard for our demands and security concerns in NATO expansion, withdrawal from the ABM, TAT, and so on. One wants to ask, why? Why all this? For what? Well, you don't want to see us as a friend and ally, but why make an enemy out of us? This is only one answer. This is not about our political regime. It's not about something else. They just don't need such a big independent country like Russia. This is the answer to all questions. This is the source of traditional American policy towards Russia. Hence, the attitude to all our proposals in the field of security. Today, one glance at the map is enough to see how Western countries have kept their promises to prevent NATO from moving eastward. They just cheated. We received 5 waves of NATO expansion, one after another. In 1999, Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary were admitted to the alliance. In the 2004, Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Slovakia and Slovenia. In 2009, Albania and Croatia. In 2017, Montenegro. In 2020, North Macedonia. As a result, the alliance, its military infrastructure came directly to the borders of Russia. This became one of the key causes of the European security crisis. It had the most negative impact on the entire system of international relations and led to the loss of mutual trust. The situation continues to deteriorate, including in the strategic sphere. Thus, in Romania and Poland, as a part of US project to create a global missile defense system, position areas for anti-missiles are being deployed. It's well known that the launchers located here can be used for Tomahawk cruise missiles, strike offensive systems. In addition, the United States is developing the Standard 6 universal missile, which alone with solving the problem of air defense and missile defense can hit both ground and surface targets. This is supposedly defense US missile defense system is expanding and new offensive capabilities are emerging. The information we have gives every reason to believe that Ukraine's entry into NATO and subsequent deployment of alliance facilities here of foregone conclusion. It is a matter of time. We clearly understand that under such a scenario, a level of military threats to Russia will rise dramatically, many times over, and I pay special attention that the danger of the sudden strike against our country will increase many times over. Let me explain what the American strategic planning documents contains the possibility of so-called preemptive strike against enemy missile systems, and who is the main enemy of US and NATO. We also know it's Russia. NATO documents officially declare our country the main threat of Euro-Atlantic security, and Ukraine. We will serve as a forward springboard for such a strike. If our ancestors had heard about this, they probably simply would not have believed it, and today we don't want to believe it, but it's true. I want this to be understood both in Russia and in Ukraine. Many Ukrainian airfields are located close to our borders. NATO tactical aviation stationed here, including carriers of high-precision weapons, will be able to hit our territory to death to the Volgograd-Kazan-Samara-Astrakhan line. The deployment of radar reconnaissance assets on the territory of Ukraine will allow NATO to tightly control the airspace of Russia right up to the Urals. Finally, after the United States broke the intermediate-range nuclear force treaty, the Pentagon is already openly developing the whole range of ground-based strike weapons, including ballistic missiles capable to reach targets at a distance up to 5,500 kilometers. If such systems are deployed in Ukraine, they will be able to hit objects throughout the European territory of Russia as well as beyond the Urals. The flight time to Moscow for Tomahawk cruise missiles will be able less than 35 minutes. For ballistic missiles from the Kharkov region, 7-8 minutes, and for hypersonic strike weapons, 4-5 minutes. This is called directly knife to the throat, and they no doubt exactly to realize that plans, just as they have repeatedly done in the past years, expanding NATO eastward, punishing military infrastructure and equipment to Russian borders, completely ignoring our concerns, protests and warning. They just split on them and did whatever they wanted, whatever they saw it fit. And of course, they intend to continue to behave in the same way according to well-known saying, the dog barks but caravan moves on. I will say right away what we did not agree to this and will never agree. At the same time, Russia has always advocated and advocates that the most difficult problems by resolved by political and diplomatic methods at the negotiation table. We are well aware of our colossal responsibility of regional and global stability. Back in 2008, Russia put forward an initiative on conclude a European security treaty. Its meaning was not a single state and not a single international organization in the Euro-Atlantic could strengthen its security at the expense of the security of others. However, our proposal was rejected out of the blue. It is impossible, they say, to allow Russia to limit the activities of NATO. Moreover, we were explicitly taught that only members of the North Atlantic Alliance can have legally binding security guarantees. Last December, we handed over to our Western partners a draft treaty between the Russian Federation and the United States of America on security guarantees, as well as a draft agreement on measures to ensure the security of Russian Federation and NATO member states. There were many common words to response from the United States and NATO. Rational Ukrainians were also contained, but all these concerns, secondary points, and looked like an attempt to shake up the issue, divert the discussion to the side. We responded to this in an appropriate way, stressed that we are ready to follow the path of negotiation, however, in condition that all issues are considered as whole, as a packages, without being separated from the main, basic Russia proposal. And they contain three key points. The first is to prevent further NATO expansion. The second is the refusal of the alliance to deploy strike weapons systems on Russian borders, and finally, the return of the bloc's military potential and infrastructure in the Europe to the state of in 1997, when the Russian NATO Founding Act was signed. It is precisely these fundamental proposals of ours have been ignored. The Western partners, I repeat, once again voiced the learned formulas that each state has the right to the freely choose ways to ensure its security and enter into any military alliances. But as nothing has changed in their position. The same reference to the notorious open-door policy of NATO held. Moreover, they are again trying to blackmail us. They are again treating with sanctions which, by the way, they will still introduce as Russia's sovereignty strengthening and the power of our armed forces grows. And the pretext for another sanctions attack will always be found or simply fabricated, regardless of the situation in Ukraine. There is only one goal: to restrain the development of Russia, and they will do it as they did before, even without any formal pretext at all. Just because we exist and will never compromise our sovereignty, national interests and our values. I'd like to say clearly and directly, in the current situation when our proposal for an equal dialogue on fundamental issues have actually gone unanswered by the United States and NATO, when the level of threats of our country is growing significantly, Russia has every right to take retaliatory measures to ensure its own security. That is exactly what we will do. As for the state of affairs in the Donbass, we see that the ruling elite in Kyiv constantly and publicly declares its unwillingness to implement the Minsk package of measures to resolve the conflict, and is not interested in a peaceful solution. On the contrary, it is trying to organize a blitzkrieg in Donbass again. It's already happened in 2014 and 2015. How these adventures ended when we remember. Now, particularly, not a single day goes by without shelling the settlement in Donbass. The former large military group constantly uses attack drones, heavy equipment, rockets, artillery and multiply rocket launchers. The killing of civilians, blockade, the abuse of people, including children, women, the elderly, does not stop. As we say, there is no end in sight to this, and so-called civilized world of which our Western colleagues self-appointedly declare themselves to be the only representatives, prefers not to notice this, as if all this horror, the genocide, to which almost 4 million people are subjected, does not exist, and only because these people did not agree with the supported West cop in Ukraine in 2014, opposed the elevated to the rank of state movement in the direction of the Kiev and aggressive nationalism and neo-Nazism. And they are fighting for their elementary rights to live on their own land, to speak their own language, to preserve their culture and traditions. How long can this strategy continue? How much longer can you endure this? Russia has done everything to prevent the territorial integrity of Ukraine. All these years, persistently and patiently fought for the implementation of UN Security Council Resolution 2202 of February 17, 2015, which consolidated the Minsk package of the measure of February 2015 to resolve the situation in Donbass. Everything is in vain. Presidents and rather deputies changed essence, aggressive nationalist character of regime itself, which seized power in Kiev, does not change. It is entirely and completely a product of the 2014 coup d'etat, and those who then embarked on the path of violence, bloodshed, lawlessness, did not recognize any other solution in the Donbass issue except of the military one. In this regard, I consider it necessary to take a long overdue decision to immediately recognize the dependence of and sovereignty of the Donetsk People's Republic and the Lugansk People's Republic. I ask the Federal Assembly of the Russian Federation to support this decision and then ratify the treaty of friendship and mutual assistance with both republics. These two documents will be prepared and signed in the very near future. And from those who seized and hold power in Kiev, we demand an immediate cessation of hostilities. Otherwise, all responsibility for the possible continuation of the bloodshed will be entirely on the consistent of the regime ruling on the territory of Ukraine. Announcing the decisions taken today, I am confident in support of the citizens of Russia, all the patriotic forces of the country. Thank you for your attention.